Welcome back to another episode of the Citizen Effect Podcast. My name is Keith Whiddon. I am one half of Whiddon Criminal Defense, joined today, as usual, with Mr. Devin Jones.
I'm Devin Jones. I am partner to Eoy Young and one half of Race Morris.
And today we are joined by Martina, who is a criminal defense lawyer in Oakland, California, and she's here to tell her story today and give us a new perspective because, Devin, you and I talk a lot about what it's like practicing law down here in the South and all the crazy stories that we get. So we get a whole new perspective on the practice of law, I guess, in and out of the courtroom, professionally, personally, all those kind of things from Martina. So, Martina, tell us who you are, where you're from, and where people can find you on social and the internet.
Hi, everyone. So I am a criminal defense attorney based out of Oakland now. Just recently, about 7 months, I started out with a Nieves firm, and I am going solo. As for finding me on the internet right now, it's going to be a bit challenging. I'm in the process of getting all of that set up. No website just yet, but should be having one up and rolling pretty soon.
You weren't always with the firm that you're with now. You spent some time as a public defender in California.
Yeah, the majority of my career. So I've been doing this about 15 years now. But all of that up until about 7 months ago had been primarily criminal defense. I had a brief stint doing private before, but that was really early on in my career. So I've been in a bunch of public defenders' offices. I started off in Solano County, probably not one you guys know about there, San Bernardino, Monterey, and most recently San Francisco.
Okay. And I imagine being a public defender here in Ouachita Parish, as well as most parishes in Louisiana, they give you a check at the end of the month and 1099 at the end of the year, and they wish you the best of luck. So what's it like when it comes to being a public defender? Is it a different setup? Is it a setup that's more analogous to being in the DA's office maybe?
Yeah, I'd say it's more analogous to that. Each office I've worked in has a completely different sort of kind of ethos. Most recently, San Francisco Public Defender's Office, they are top notch. Jeff Adachi, who passed away right when I started, actually, 2019, his belief was that, you needed to be as good as any private attorney. And so he really wanted to put the county's money where his mouth was in terms of experts and like pushing the law. And we really saw a lot of changes coming out of that office. They had a bail unit. They have a mental health unit. They really did a ton of really important work for the state and country. So being in that office is not like I suspect some of these other public defenders' offices across the country. It's all eyes on you, and everyone kind of thinks you're the best in the state, and they expect excellence. So it was a really great experience. But I would say on the whole, California public defenders' offices are quite good. There's a couple offices that sound kind of similar to what you're talking about, where it's independent contractors, not a lot of oversight, not a lot of quality control, maybe not a lot of money for experts. In San Francisco, I think my caseload started off at 40 clients. And I was in a general felony rotation through homicides. That got really high during COVID because we weren't able to resolve because of trials not being sent out. We had a backlog, I think, of 600 clients in custody for what's kind of a small county, even though San Francisco is a big city. But all the public defenders' offices that I've worked for really do try to do good work in terms of funding their experts and doing things like, I've worked with a lot of neuropsychs and pushing unconsciousness defenses and things like that I suspect maybe aren't funded as well in other states.
I would think that you're right. When you say that you pushed a lot of law or legislation, what are some of the laws or legislation that you were able to be a part of yourself that you thought was really important or was really beneficial for your practice areas?
Well, one of the big ones, now I wasn't on the forefront of the case itself, but one of the biggest cases that came out recently is the Humphrey case. And that's about bail and that people shouldn't be tied to a bail schedule and that it has to be narrowly tailored to the individual specifics. So San Francisco pushed that one as a San Francisco case. But I remember when I was a public defender down in San Bernardino, I was watching everything they did. So we have a statewide training. I'm sure you guys have something similar. California Public Defenders Association. And I was watching all of their trainings, and you're coming forward and bringing these bail motions. And it's just kind of crushing when you have this new case coming out saying, nope, the way you've been doing it is completely wrong. You have to have an evidentiary hearing. You have to actually show under specific, clear and convincing evidence why you're doing this. So that was really an interesting time. And I think it's really changed things. They've now codified that in legislation. My personal passion is in neuropsych, and I haven't been part of any legislation, but I am really focusing on that and trying to get more public defenders to use neuropsychs. How can we make that affordable? How can we change jury instructions? Because I think a lot of them are really wrong out here. Specifically, the reasonable person standard in self-defense. In California, we don't consider mental health, quote unquote, issues in assessing the mental or the reasonable person standard, but they would consider a physical problem. And I think the real problem is that we've lost a lot in language, in that if we call it a mental health issue versus a physical issue, whereas something like schizophrenia truly is a physical issue. It's degeneration of the brain. So that's my current pet project, but no legislation has come out just yet, but hopefully you'll see it on the rise.
Right. What is the importance of working with, and this is for the person who is not in the trenches like you may be, or I may be, or Devin may be, what is the importance of working with the neuropsych in establishing a defense and communicating that defense to a judge, jury, and prosecutor?
I mean, it's so incredibly important. And I think it's one of those things right now that people really underestimate how mental health issues are coming into play in the majority of our client populations, whether that's public defense or private. TBIs, traumatic brain injuries. You can get them in high school. You can get them before high school. We're talking about, they think right now in prison, 1 out of every 10 people incarcerated nationally has a TBI or CET. Now, you can't diagnose conclusively CET. That's what we think O.J. Simpson might have, or some of these players who've been hit in the head a lot and have anger issues, right? They have, what's happening is their prefrontal cortex has been damaged. And so when your executive functioning has gone down, you just don't really have the ability to make the decisions the same way that somebody whose executive functioning is working. But when we start looking even at different populations that we might encounter in private, ADHD, people who are not neurotypical, people who are on the spectrum, all of these really factor in. And getting a judge to understand, I've got a juvie case right now where even just presenting what the juvenile brain, kind of what his capabilities are, I think is really important to get people to humanize and see your client's side of things. And people respond, and we know this, right? People love DNA, and they respond to it in this way that it's kind of like witchcraft, right? We start talking about DNA and trying to get people to break it down, and they're like, well, no, DNA is science. So once you start really classifying things as science and demystifying this kind of airy-fairy idea about mental health, it really starts to change the calculus. Now in San Francisco, we are dealing, it's incredible, right? The majority of people in that community, the public defender community, really are severely affected by, different types of paranoid or delusional disorders. You've got just so many of them, whether it's drug-induced psychosis or schizophrenia. And getting people to understand that they're not truly acting on rational impulses can really help empathy overall, and helping understand that this is not something that they created. It's not, just a thought in their head. It's a physical structure in their brain that has been altered forever. And it's challenging, and it's a double-edged sword, but I think it's super important.
What are the blowback that you get from prosecutors or even judges whenever you try to even get this evidence in front of a jury?
Well, to be fair, it's been really rough. And San Francisco was one of the first counties to push the unconsciousness defense. Now we have that out here, where it's kind of like Ambien, right? That's how I would analogize it. Sleepwalking, right? So the prefrontal cortex is shut down. You're in such a psychotic-induced state that you are no longer in control. You're no longer the actor. And when you start trying to say that that's a defense, I had a case where because it's not on the mitigation side, it's a guilt side defense. Mm-hmm. And so the blowback really becomes what happens. I had a veteran when this went to trial. It started off as attempt murder. He was sitting on the pier over at Pier 39. A girl runs by, a young girl, 20 or so, runs by. He gets up, just casually walks up and plants a hunting knife in her back, nicks her spine. gets on his bike, rides about a mile away, whaps a woman on the head with a wrench. And then when he's tackled by the police, he's able to provide his ID. He's able to say his name. He can talk a little bit about what happened and what he remembered, but he didn't really clearly talk about any of his mental health issues. So that ended up going to trial. And throughout the phases of it getting there, there was a lot of pushback on all fronts, because there's a lot of fear of people who have mental health issues, veterans especially, PTSD. But then when you've got a guilt level defense like that, what do we do? Put him back on the street? And that's exactly what happened. The jury walked him, and it was goodbye. You know, I was like, would you like to, you know, I can walk you over to the VA? And he's like, bye. And I'm like, okay, please don't kill anyone. And so that was it. He got his clothes, and I never saw him again. And so I do think even on the defense attorney side, I had a lot of anxiety about that, because you can't control it. You know, he was from Florida. He rode the rails in his little conductor hat and overalls. I mean, he was just precious in my opinion, but you know, he just looks like some old timey guy riding the rails, and he just wanted to get right back on the rails and move along. And so judges don't love that. And there was a lot of kind of media about it, and it's scary, I think, for people. It is truly a defense, but the question then becomes, what do we do for, you know, the population? The girl who got stabbed was none too pleased.
Right.
And I think that became my question. What is the outcome of that other than a not guilt?
That's it. That's a not guilty. If you find somebody not guilty by, and it does work both on specifics and general, right? So he was charged. We got it down after the 995 and preliminary hearing down to a 245A1, which is a general intent crime in California, assault with deadly weapon. Which is always what the sticking point would have been potentially if you were just trying to negate the specific intent with unconsciousness. But there's nothing. If you, the jury, find unconsciousness to this person to not be a product of his actions, right? He's not acting rationally on true intent, whether it's general or specific, he's out the door. So, you know, I think a lot of judges are trying to keep that instruction out. They try to exclude your experts. They try to find a way to kind of silence you on that front. I don't think enough attorneys in California are utilizing this. And I do think the counties that are more open to it are also the counties that have good mental health diversion courts. So San Francisco has a really good mental health diversion program. We have a section out here where if you engage in 2 years of treatment, it gets dismissed. And then we also have behavioral health court, where if you enter a plea on these more serious cases, it can be withdrawn. So we have other options that I think in a case like that, you know, it sends a message to people, you know, please grant our request to go to these courts, or else you might not have any recourse. But in the case of Mr. Kennedy, he didn't want to do either one of those courts. So here we were.
You know, when I was a prosecutor, I started reading this book. It's called The Anatomy of Violence. It's a really good book, but it talked about the history that basically we stopped studying the scientific causes of violence as it relates to biology and somebody's physiological makeup, because basically all these creepy contraptions came out. They'd stick stuff on your head. Cesar Lombroso was really one of the last ones to really do it. And then it was all these kooky machines. And so it got so crazy that we were measuring bumps on head that basically they said, hey, this is crazy science. We walked away from it for over a century.
Well, phrenology is fraught with a lot of eugenics as well, right? When we're talking about the bumps on the head and being able to see certain psychological maladies and talking about it in that sense, there's also been a really strong history of that being tied to poor populations and racism. So there is a double-edged sword, right? Where people are really afraid of these things. And if we tend to study lower income populations, like with CET, we're primarily focusing on a prison population that is largely certain socioeconomic groups as well as racial groups. So it gets really murky as to advocating for the science. But I do think the one thing I really want to push that I'm trying to put together some trainings on is how we speak about it. Because I think there's a way to speak about it in the legal context where we can start dispelling some of the fear. and normalizing it when we talk about it as being a physical issue. But once you get into the kind of kooky things that you're talking about, that only kind of adds to the mystification of it, right? And making and adding to the fear. So what we really want to do is look at it in a way that really shows this isn't so abnormal, right? Your kid might have ADHD, and that's an executive functioning disorder. Just the same way schizophrenia is an executive functioning disorder. And when we start kind of making it seem a lot more everyday instead of like, you know, scary machines, even though the machines today that test for these things are still probably pretty scary, MRIs, they just, you know, are bigger and maybe more technically advanced. But it's something that's happening in all of our brains to some extent. How much executive functioning does each one of us have? I have ADHD, so I've got to say, in getting into the science, I'm like, oh, wow, that really makes a lot of sense. For me, I'm more impulse driven than maybe somebody else. Somebody else might be able to sit and process their feelings, their words, their actions better than somebody with ADHD. And so I think that can be a really good analogy when you're talking about it to juries, to judges, to other people out there, because we've got to start moving away from this idea that it's this scary thing that happens in back rooms at mental health institutions where somebody puts like something that looks like a metal colander on your head. You know, I think we all have those kinds of electroshock fears in the back of our mind, and it's not. It's just our brains are a really weird, complicated machine that we're learning about, and the law is catching up to science. And we had been looking at mental health issues as let's sit and talk about our feelings for so long, and we've been ignoring that it's real physical science, the same way you'd get a knee MRI'd or a shoulder.
This book pushes of interest that basically at the time we stopped studying the scientific reasons behind why people could exhibit more violent characteristics. At the same time, we had the increase of criminal laws. You know, through the 50s and 60s, we put more criminal laws on the books, and to this day, there's actually an infamous book by an ex-federal prosecutor that talks about the 50 laws you break every day. And so we began to over-criminalize things while not addressing a very real topic that people can't get around. You know, just these things people have, they can't get around. So I think it's very interesting what you're doing and pushing the envelope in that. And it just kind of coincides with this book, that book I read, which was Anatomy of Violence. In fact, I still have it to this day over the course of all the moves. It's just sitting there.
Well, and I think maybe what's at the root of that, if you start thinking about what was scary, what you're saying, why people stopped, is it's maybe on some level, if you start to show that we're not in control of our actions, or that there are root causes beyond just he did a bad thing, he's a bad person, he shouldn't have done it, it makes our system a lot more complicated. It starts to look like we're maybe being jerks by prosecuting all this stuff for people who were born with certain predispositions that might be too difficult for them to, you know, overbear. So I don't know.
I think correct. I think they didn't know what to do, and so they said, well, let's walk away.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of a similar struggle that we're dealing with right now in this exact context, which is, what do we do with our system when people can be not guilty of horrific acts just by simply a product of their brain structure? Are we just going to be giving everyone a free pass to either be violent or kind of get out of jail free card, right? Because we really do want to believe, to live in a safe society, that people have to be in control of their actions. And once we open up that idea that they're not necessarily, it gets really complicated for people.
And I think it gets complicated for these legislators that won't fund mental health.
Well, and that's the problem we always keep coming back to in California, which is, you know, it's not our job to solve the problem that Reagan created. And, you know, I can sit here, it's, you know, no shock that the San Francisco public defender is very liberal, and blame Reagan for a lot of these things, right? That, you know, he decided to defund the statewide mental health institutions, and it's not our fault that we don't have a structure in place for people who are this debilitated. And we don't solve that problem in the courtroom. And that has been the theme of my trials where I've done this, which is, I get that you're uncomfortable, but you know where you solve this problem? Where you vote, where you put your money, where your tax dollars go. You don't solve this here in this courtroom. And you've got to understand, if you're going to be on my jury, you have to understand we're not here to fix society's ills. You've got one choice, right? Is this person culpable in a legal sense? That's it. And I think that's really tough for people.
Have jurors been have jurors that you've voir dire, are they receptive to that? Is it a mix, or?
It's absolutely a mix.
Okay.
Now, I do think we are dealing with California populations, and I've only run this as a trial defense in San Francisco. I've used it as a mitigation kind of workup, even though I'm using it as a trial, but I'm showing the expert reports to prosecutors down in maybe the more conservative red counties like San Bernardino, where it's really conservative. But I haven't run that defense there. So I don't know what the jurors would say there. But in California, you would think that we're talking like super liberal. No, they're not really receptive.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people are very, very angry right now at what they see on a day-to-day basis, because so many of them are like I can't, there's probably nothing that, unless you've been to San Francisco or Oakland recently, it's like zombie nation, right? I mean, the fentanyl problem, and they're so angry at that it just becomes like a free-for-all at them being angry. It's wild. But then they themselves.
Before I came here, I was actually reading Yahoo News. It might actually age me to say I read Yahoo News, but I'm going to confess to that. I was reading Yahoo News. It was talking about San Francisco's problem. And they thought they could solve the homeless problem with all these programs to house them. And really what it is they're down to homeless who are just simply either mentally ill or drug addicted at this point. And they do have some people who are just due to circumstances homeless, but it is a very small percentage of the population. They just don't know what to do with it.
The problem is, and I've, worked in that community for almost 4 years, still do, I guess. So over 4 years. But it's not just San Francisco's problem. We take all of the Bay Area's problems on, right? They come to San Francisco. The majority of clients I had didn't start out as San Franciscans. They're coming from the surrounding counties. I had clients from Ohio, Florida. I mean, the guy I did the unconsciousness trial with, that was a Floridian. So you end up seeing a lot of people because everyone migrates this way. And now, some people want to say, well, they come here because they know. No, I mean, if I was homeless, am I going to want to stay somewhere where that it snows? Absolutely not. So, you've got certain factors that are outside the city's control. I do think that there is this myth. There's a lot of programs available. There's not. It is incredibly hard to get our clients into programs. But then you do run into the problem that I think people think it is, which is people don't want help. If you have schizophrenia, you don't want help the majority of the time. You're not in a place to use your executive functioning, which is non-existent because you have the disorder to say, I need help. So when someone says, do this thing I don't want to do, go to this program, live in this house where people are, either going to sexually assault you or take your money, or, it's just a very uncomfortable situation, bed bugs, things like that. It's dangerous. It's dirty. And they're like, this is help. And you're like, nah, I don't think so. I'm going to pass. So, it is a really complicated problem that I just don't see how we fix. And I think with mental health, especially schizophrenia, I get really kind of sometimes disheartened because I don't have the solutions. Somebody much smarter than me and, with a medical degree is going to need to figure that out. But clients with schizophrenia really are tough to help in a lot of times.
They are. We didn't have Reagan except for as a president, but I can tell you this much. We had Bobby Jindal, and in 2008 and I was a prosecutor from 2011 to 16, from 2008 till right at 2016, he didn't fund anything in mental health. When I started as a prosecutor, somebody came in drug addicted. You could get them released on bail to a rehab facility, 35 days paid by the state, detox. By the time I left, you would get a social worker and they'd say, can they try outpatient first? I thought, yeah, hell, that's what they were trying when they broke into the house.
Exactly.
How is this helping? And by the time they got out, they never made it to the first outpatient meeting.
Never. And a handful of times, maybe. I don't want to say never, but yeah, very similar experience here.
It's hard. And if you don't have any of those extra resources, I used to tell people all the time, do I have a burglary problem or do I have a drug problem? Because it seems if I solve the drugs, I'm probably not going to have somebody breaking into a house. I just don't find too many people who that's their fetish.
Right. Well, and then that's the problem, right? It's like, do we have a schizophrenia mental health drug problem, or do we have a society where the have and have nots are becoming so disparate, right? So far apart. And part of what I'm finding as I'm putting together this training and, leaning into the research, they're finding that physical trauma, emotional trauma, leads to schizophrenia. There's really high overlap. And then you've got the physical trauma. Think about kids who are physically abused, right? How many times if they get hit in the head a couple times, 3-4 times, they have a high likelihood of having CET. And then we're dealing with those populations and being like, why don't you help yourself? And these are populations where if we reduce the amount of physical and emotional trauma they were experiencing as children, it's a much bigger economic problem than just that we can fix in the courtrooms, right? We have to get people's home life more stable, and it seems like society is going the other direction.
It is.
Yeah.
We had a similar issue arise in bankruptcy. There's a famous study from about 4 years ago, and the judges used it, and they said, look, basically you Chapter 13 attorneys make money off these people by them filing bankruptcy, and then they get dismissed and you never help them.
Yeah.
And they had results from Memphis to show that this disproportionately affected African-American communities. My retort to all the judges was this: I don't dispute the findings, but what I dispute is that you guys are coming in here saying that this is causation when you don't realize the correlation is that population in that area tends to be the low socioeconomic population. And nobody wanted to talk about that because that wasn't fun. What was fun was to say that attorneys are evil people making money off their clients and not getting discharges. Well, what do you do when Sally has a car and she needs to keep it? And then the car goes to crap halfway through the bankruptcy and she just dismisses it and gets out. It was this, I found that the judicial system often will find causation where there's correlation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think humans in general, right? We love to mix up the two. And it's right now, there's so many problems that you can say definitely correlate to what ends up before us in the, legal system. And it's really difficult to figure out what the root cause really is. And realistically, I mean, there's a good reason I'm never going to be a politician. I don't have any solutions, right? Things are messy right now. And especially out here in these very dense cities where we have huge populations of people who are living way below the poverty line. And we just don't have the structure to deal with it. We could get into debate about tax money and where things are going and what we're doing with it and the corruption. I'm sure we'd be on opposite ends of the spectrum there. But, I think it's just, no matter how you slice it, it is a problem that ends up in our laps in the criminal defense world, right? That we have to deal with the product of whatever these situations were that created these people. And it's tough, right? To get people to understand and be empathetic. That not a single one of my clients ever said when they were, 7 years old, I want to be a fentanyl riddled, schizophrenic on the street of San Francisco. These aren't choices that people are happy about. And I think trying to get people back to that point of understanding, I think, is always the goal.
I think as a prosecutor, I went to every homicide scene for 5 years where we were. And you look at these cases and somewheres, and you hit this, what you said, there's somewheres between guilty and not guilty. And for so long, we've either divided them into the two categories. And it's that gray area in the middle that nobody wants to talk about.
Yeah.
It's the whisper when you're at the bench and the judge says, well, I think they're kind of crazy, but they're not insane.
Yeah. Well, to the book you were citing before, like the 50 laws you break every day, the bias that ends up, why are we focusing on certain crimes versus others? Who gets focused on? What populations get policed? I firmly believe that the legal system sets up a false narrative, like this false dichotomy between guilty and not guilty. We all live in the gray area.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think I became a defense attorney because I'm like, yeah, I understand wanting to stab someone. I get that. So I'm like, you know, I can empathize with my clients in a way that maybe people who are on some other end of the spectrum might not, you know, like, you know, there but for fortune, right? I can prevent myself from acting on my impulses. But if I couldn't, you know, I'd be like Mr. Kennedy, just stabbing strangers all the time. So, you know, I think there's a lot of empathy that you know, being a defense attorney can bring that you have to try to share with people, that it's not black or white.
No.
And so that's a really good segue into, you are in the process of starting your own firm. In fact, that may be off the ground by the time this gets published. What is going to separate your firm, what you do, from other law offices or other criminal defense lawyers?
Great question. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I think I had always thought I was going to be a ride or die public defender forever. And I'm bounced around a lot of offices, somewhat through my own making. I tend to be very vocal about when I find other people's actions or their legal work to be subpar. I'm very vocal when I disagree with management. I don't like, you know, someone collecting a paycheck and going home and pleading out clients and not working really hard. So I think I've been consistently dissatisfied with the representation that I've seen as a whole, even from really good offices. Mm-hmm. And so I think for me, if I'm going to be happy, I have to kind of do the practice the way that I think is ethical and the way that I think is, you know, promoting excellence. So I don't ever find, I mean, I shouldn't say ever. I've got a handful of really good friends that I think are excellent. But I have yet to find an office where I'm surrounded by people that I'm like, oh yeah, I feel like you're not dragging me down. So for me, I really want to figure out how to do this private work ethically, right? Whether that's a sliding scale for homicide clients or factoring in people's economic status, but also finding a way to do it where I'm not taking on too many clients. So it's going to be challenging, right? We've got a thing called the Racial Justice Act out here. That is a new law that says there can't be bias in any aspect of the court case, whether it's the prosecution or the, you know, rulings by the bench or voir dire or anything. And so it's really open-ended in how we can use it. So people have been using it very creatively, because what it gets you is the public records data on certain filings. So let's say, for instance, one that just got granted was the data in Contra Costa regarding the charging of the gang enhancements. I'm really kind of passionate about taking on cases like that, right? If I can find ones where I can move my pet passions, right, like the neuropsych and the RJA issues forward, I want to be able to make the decisions to do that with my firm, and not kind of be bound by a boss's decisions. So those issues, finding a way to use private practice to push those two issues forward, I think is really central to my practice.
And getting started, are you going to have resources in California that are going to give you access to experts and things like that maybe your clients would not ordinarily be able to afford?
Great question. I'm figuring that out as I go. So we've got the Harris motion here. I think you guys do too. I think it's a Supreme Court case, where it says if you've been representing somebody and you've either been at the public defender's office and you go private or private to private or conflict, you're not entitled under Dumas to have the appointed counsel of choice. Mm-hmm. But these circumstances where you can cite to objective factors why a certain lawyer is necessary, you can be appointed even if you're private. So I am trying to do that on my two homicides that I am that are coming with me from the firm that I'm in now. And once you're appointed, then you do have access to the resources like a public defender. You would have access to funding for hopefully the experts that I want. I've got a handful of them that I really love and respect that I work with a lot. And then I am trying to do some appointed work, which I think kind of keeps me in the public defender realm, right? I don't want to ever be the private lawyer that's taking clients away from public defender's offices, right? Unless there's a really good reason. But, let's say, for instance, Contra Costa, Alameda, you've got public defender's offices that are really good, and you've got funding and you've got resources. So I'm definitely not going to be trying to pull, the gun case away from one of those unless the person really, really wants it. But yeah, I think keeping my hand in the appointed cases is going to help me, because I do run into the problem a lot with the private clients that you're like, oh, by the way, I want this neuropsych. It's going to be $10,000 to $15,000 extra. Is that chill? They're like, no.
Right. It's one. That's what I was going to say is in the criminal defense world, I'm really boutique on stuff I've done, and for the most part, I don't do it anymore. But the cases that need the experts the most are often the ones with the least resources.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yes.
The one that can pay that $50,000 retainer
probably doesn't need the neuropsych.
No, that person generally just needs a good excuse. But the person who struggles to make that $200 payment a month, and you're dumping 400 hours in the case, and you just have no resources, and it's almost defeating.
Yeah.
It's hard.
110% agree. It's really hard. And I think California, we're lucky. Certain counties were really lucky to have additional funding. Other counties, not so much, so it really is kind of a mixed bag here. But I think California kind of goes back to the funding on the public defender's offices, because we have pay parity, because we do have such kind of strong people advocating for those resources. There is, I guess, a system in place where we are getting those experts quite routinely. I think it's going to be harder. I have yet to be able to test out my theories. Right now, it could just be I'm living in a dreamland, because at the public defender's office in San Francisco, for instance, you have a budget and you're petitioning to your boss. You're not petitioning to a judge. And it's going to be different when I'm petitioning to a judge saying, I need the funding for this, judge, so you can understand. For instance, let's talk about like a juvie case. Judge, where you're the jury, right? Because you don't get a jury in juvenile. I want a neuropsych so I can help you understand juvenile development. They're going to be like, I'm good. Thanks.
Right.
So yeah, I think I'm going to be running into those challenges, and it's going to be probably harder than I think it is.
What other challenges do you foresee in building your own practice from the ground up that may not relate to legal? What are some of those things that you're worried about now outside of the client side?
I'm terrified about finances. To be honest, I think coming from the public defender side, I think I definitely am a bleeding heart. I lost my first Harris motion. I ran one and it was denied. And so now I've got my first pro bono case. So I'm taking on, a 290. It's a pretty severe, it's a temp rape attempt, and completed other sex acts. A minor, and I'm doing that one pro bono now. So, Trey is consistently being like, know your worth, know your value. And I'm like, but the clients, so I think I'm going to have some heartbreaking moments where it's going to be hard for me to say no. I'm not really good at that. I'm like, if I see someone I want to help, I want to help. And I don't yet know what the cost of doing that pro bono and my time is going to look like. So yeah, I think that's going to be a big challenge, trying to find my footing there.
Well, I can tell you, I've done the time equation on a case, even one where I was paid and Keith was kind of involved in it and tracked the time. And if you're passionate about it, you don't realize the amount of time you can be consumed.
Yeah.
It quickly got into the $100,000 mark.
Yep.
And it was, the payment was well less than that, but it's a case that was passionate. But sometimes passion doesn't pay the light bill. No,
it doesn't. It doesn't make payroll. It doesn't pay the light bill. It doesn't pay the rent.
Yeah.
So, but it does get you up in the morning.
It does.
And that's the difference.
Yeah.
Is that getting up in the morning puts you in position to pay the light bill and the rent and the payroll.
I think that's where those passion cases come in. Is sometimes they're not monetary, but they're mental capital.
Yeah.
Totally.
They keep you going.
Totally. And I've got one lawyer out here who I think does it really well. He takes on appointed cases. He manages his time really well, but he says the exact same thing, right? It gets you out of bed in the morning and it reminds you why you do this. Because if it all just looks like one sea of DUIs, you can start to feel like, oh my gosh, like, believe me, if I have the right number of DUIs, I like them. But if that was my entire practice, I think I'd want to gouge my eyes out. You know, it's just, you can only handle so many riser defenses before you're just like, I'm out, you know, but you want to be present for all of your clients, whether they're the ones that are paying full price or, you know, whether or not I institute this sliding scale. I don't know how I'm going to do that. So there's just a lot of unknowns, you know.
And when you say institute a sliding scale, is this basically based on a potential client's income at the time that they come to your office?
Yeah, right. Or for instance, there was somebody that came in the other day who had a resisting arrest case. Mm-hmm. And everybody had been quoting her 10 or 12. And I came down to 7 because I really do think the cops were screwing with her. And she was like, can you do 5? And I was like, let me think on it. And then Trey talked me out of it. And he actually cited you, Keith. And he was, no, don't negotiate your worth. And I was like, I went back and I said 7. And even that, I felt horrible. Like I wanted to be like, sure, 5, I'll do it for 5. Like,
right.
It still feels uncomfortable for me to talk about money or like value my time because I've never had to do it. One of my friends bills at $6.50 an hour. And I'm like, what? Are you kidding me? Like people can pay that? Like I'm flabbergasted, right? So I think it's gonna be tough to make this a business and not just a charity project.
Absolutely. And that's the biggest thing is that you have to remember that as much as you are in your position to help people, it isn't a charity. So, and that's difficult to realize from one day to the next, and especially whenever you are looking at the case where you genuinely believe that this person only got arrested because that cop had nothing better to do. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah. It's like, the ones where you want to screw the system, but again, maybe I just need to find a way to say you can take X number of passion projects per month or per year. You can't, take every single one on that comes your way.
Yep. I think that's a great place to start would be that I'm only going to allow myself to have X number of cases per quarter that are my, I don't want to say favorites is the wrong word, but that are my passion project that speak to what I want to do or speak to how I can change the legal landscape in my community or in my state.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I've took on too many of those passion cases before, and it quickly went from mental capital to mental anxiety.
Yeah, there's that too, right? Which is I don't know how stressful it's going to be to take these on when I'm trying to juggle driving and going to different courthouses. It's very different than when you're a public defender and you can just walk across the street. So what's one more case? But what's one more case when you're driving hours to another courthouse is a big difference,
That's for sure.
And look, Louisiana, when I came back here from Mississippi, they said, oh, we have a public defender's office. I said, okay. And I started talking. I said, well, where's their office at? They said, well, they're just contractors. And I thought, ooh, they don't even have an office. I mean, it works well. I think all those people who are involved in that program do it. There's a lot more passion in it than there is probably the actual payment. But it's astounding when you look at other places in like California and Mississippi and just neighboring states, and you only have to go as far as the West Coast. And they actually have funded offices who provide levels of service rather than give out a trove of money and say, hey, cut $4,000 checks to 30 attorneys in the parish and let them defend people.
Yeah. I mean, that is a scary thing for me too, right? Like leaving the public defender world where, and I hate to be crass and talk about money, but you've got public defender's offices where you max out as a supervisor at $330. You've got the highest paid public defender's offices in the state. Even just a level 3-4 deputy in Alameda goes up to $280. $280,000 a year. And it's like, you've got that plus full benefits, plus a pension, plus 6 weeks vacation, plus, and then so start to think on the other end, on the private side of things, you're just like, oh my gosh, have I just signed up for a nightmare? Like, fine, maybe I just need to get myself back in line and be able to take orders from management a little better, right? You're like, So it is very different, I think, out here than some of the other states where, you know, you start off, you know.
Oh, look, you'll get a public defender around here, and I've never checked from, but from what I understand, you'll get a capped out public defender, $5,000 a month, 1099 with 200 clients.
Yeah. And I have taken a check, and so I can speak to that. And that's pretty much it. Never mind a secretary or a law book or a computer or a phone line.
Oh, that's awful.
Or an office to meet your clients in. That's your job to find those things.
That's awful.
Yeah, it's pretty. And then you go up against a prosecutor who's making six figures with benefits, sometimes a car.
Yeah, getting pay parity established out here was a huge thing. All the counties, because that's the fastest way to tie your stars to the prosecutor, to be like, hey, we work as hard as them, pay us the same as them. And we've done a lot of work in the unions out here. So you'll see every county has its own union, but the defense lawyers are usually in the same union as the DAs and the city attorneys. So when you can get all of them together, you see salaries change real fast.
Yeah. I think it levels the playing field. And I do think it's one of the most critical things that we lack in this state is a well-funded public defender.
Yeah.
Those people do, they do miracles on dimes.
And you can't expect that forever. You know, what I've always seen, even out here, is that there is a level of abuse that you suffer from the bench, from police officers. Like it becomes mentally very taxing to be yelled at by everybody all the time and everything be your fault and not be given the same kind of grace that the DA, like if you file a motion one day late, you know, you're going to get screwed. Whereas the DA can do whatever they want. Like, it's fine. Good cause. But then, you know, it's like after 5-10 years, everybody gets burnt out, right? And it's hard to start with the same level of passion. And I think that's any of our jobs, right? But that level of burnout is just expedited.
Yeah.
It is.
Especially when you can't pay your bills. So
right.
Well, we've gotten to right around that 45-minute mark, and I think that now might be the best time to ask the citizen effect question. The citizen effect question is simply, we've talked about neuroscience, we've talked about opening your office, we've talked about making sure that you're providing service to your passion projects, as you've called them. And the difference being between having a passion project, having a private business, and all these other things. And you've also touched on this training that you're developing, which we haven't given any time to. What is your citizen effect? How are you going to leave the legal landscape better than what you found it? Or do you have something that we haven't talked about that you want to leave better than you found it?
Well, I would say that one of the things I'm really passionate about is being the kind of person that comes into a courtroom or that you can work with, that you can get energy from, right? I think we're all, as human beings, like energy transfers. And I think I want to be a catalyst in the field, whatever it is, whether it's like, if you see another lawyer working really hard at something, I'm really excited. It kind of gives you a little like rub off effect, right? You're like, yeah, what do I care about? Maybe I should care about that too. So my overall hope, especially with the training that I want to do, is just get people to be a little more excited. And bring a little bit more of that like enthusiasm back to some of these projects. That it doesn't have to be neuropsych. I'd like it if everybody cared about it as much as I do, but what are the things that made you want to be the lawyer that you signed up to be? And are you still holding yourself to those ideals? So I would like that to be my effect in the community. And I think so far I have been, for better or worse. Sometimes, you know, that's why I tend to be good friends with the lawyers that are good. But I want to be a mirror and a catalyst to people finding more excitement and enthusiasm for this profession.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's a hell of an answer. Well, for one more outgoing, go ahead and let people know your name and where they might be able to find you in the future.
Yeah, well, hopefully there will be a website up and running. I think I'm settling with the name, the Law Offices of Martina M. Avalos. And I will be a solo practitioner as of July 1st. So I definitely will be able to be found some way if you Google me.
All right. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Martina.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Talking to you.
You bet.
All right.
All right. you.